Hi, I'm the History Guy, and I'm proud to bring to you the next episode in our series on the History Guy's hats that's exclusive for patrons on Patreon. Today we're going to go back nearly 3 millennia to talk about what a hat can tell us about one of the world's great empires. This is a Roman reproduction of a Roman-style helmet, or called a Galea. It's intended to represent the imperial Gallic style of Roman helmet. And I'll be honest to you, it's a relatively cheap reproduction. It's not as accurate as it could be, and I certainly wouldn't wear it if you're going to go fighting Gauls, but it's okay for sitting on my desk. And it does show the various parts of the Roman helmet, but the reason to look at Roman helmets isn't just in an academic study of how the pieces went together. The design of the helmet is actually historically important, and it tells us much about the rise of one of history's most influential empires. When talking about Roman helmets and Roman equipment generally, there are a few things to keep in mind. First, the Roman Empire was very large and it lasted a very long time, so there's a huge variety in the equipment. The type of uniformity seen in modern military units simply didn't exist as such. Soldiers wore a variety of clothing and did not match their fellows, even by color. Some historians say that depictions of the Roman legions carrying, say, matching shields is an idealized version of what the men actually looked like. Historians tend to group Roman helmets into types, which vary largely by time period. But some of those types overlap, and they all have a number of varieties that are often varied by region, almost certainly by maker of the helmet, as well as by the type of soldier wearing the helmet. The earliest documented versions of helmets used by the Romans, used between the 4th century BC and the 1st century AD, are called the Montefortino helmet, because the first examples archaeologists discovered were found in the region of Montefortino in Italy. Montefortino helmets are round and have an almost pine cone shape at the top. And while they may look just like a bowl, Montefortino helmets had cheek guards attached on the sides. But the material that the cheek guards were composed of, likely leather, is usually rotted away, leaving only the holes where they were affixed. Developed from Celtic helmets, Galea sometimes had names inscribed in them, and that is how we know that this design was used by Romans. They are the earliest type of helmet for which we have proof that they were used by ancient Romans. These would have been the types of helmets used by the Romans during the Punic Wars against Carthage. An interesting aspect of Montefortino helmets is that the older they are, the more decorated they are. That is because legions in the period of the Roman Republic were composed of levied men that paid for their own equipment, and wealthier men could afford more ornate designs. Later, the design was simplified as what were called the Marian reforms in the 2nd century BC allowed the recruitment of landless Romans who were mostly poor, and the helmet design was maximized for mass production. The helmet didn't just represent changing military doctrine, it represented a changing view of Roman citizenship. Literally, what it meant to be a Roman. The design was improved with the imperial helmet. This type of helmet was used during the Roman imperial period, following the breakdown of the Republic. The imperial helmet had more substantial cheek guards, which would be tied at the neck in combat. The neck guard was much bigger and actually served to deflect blows to the head. Ear guards were added, allowing the ears to be open but still protected. Ridges were added, notably the characteristic eyebrows, adding strength at critical points, and the peak added at the front to protect against downward cuts. Later, extra reinforcement was added to the crown, especially after the Dacian Wars, as the Dacians fought with huge two-handed blades that could crush through the top of the Roman helmet. This is the type of helmet that most people probably think of when asked to picture a Roman helmet in their mind. A wealthy Roman centurion may have worn a coat of mail in addition to a helmet, while those with less money would have worn bronze pectoral coverings. Curiously, there is some evidence that over-ornamented equipment was actually discouraged, as it was against the unstated Roman virtue of austerity, which some period authors point to as a reason why legions were so successful against the more heavily ornamented Eastern peoples. There are stories of generals like Scipio Aemilianus, who broke the equipment of soldiers which he believed were too ornamented. Scipio Africanus, a famous general of the Punic Wars, is recorded as criticizing a soldier who had too much decoration on his shield. Moreover, it appears that Romans kept equipment around for as long as it was serviceable, so equipment from different periods would often be found on the same battlefield. Some historians say names have been found written in the helmets, providing a basic record of the owners as it passed through different soldiers' hands. And because soldiers provided some of their own equipment, these owners may have been in the same family with Roman soldiers handing down the equipment from father to son. Another point to keep in mind is that when you go back this far in history, then there's a lot of guesswork involved. The archaeological record is sparse, and if an archaeologist, say, finds a piece of equipment in the field, they don't know for sure who wore that piece of equipment or whether it was representative of all the other pieces of equipment that were used in that battle. At times, we're just having an inkling of how some of this stuff works, but we can make some conclusions based on the evidence that we have, and those conclusions can tell us something about the making of Rome. For example, this helmet doesn't have a faceplate involved. There's no protection for the soldier's face, and that's interesting because we know at the time that Romans knew how to make faceplates for their helmets. They're examples of helmets worn by Roman gladiators in the arena, very similar to this design, that had full face protection, as well as highly detailed faceplates for Roman cavalry helmets. Not covering a legionnaire's face was a choice. This was because the soldiers needed to be able to see around them easily, to move with the unit and receive commands from the officers. Unlike gladiators, Roman legions fought as a unit. They moved as one. The Roman helmet, with its open face and ears, was maximized to follow orders and coordinate the actions of the soldiers. This often distinguished them from their opponents. Romans, of course, weren't the only army of the era to use formations. The Greek phalanx was common and used by many Roman enemies, including the Carthaginians. In the 4th century BC, the Romans started changing their tactics from the relatively inflexible phalanx to the maniple, which breaks the phalanx into smaller units and is described as a phalanx with joints. This more complex formation was more effective on broken ground, but required more discipline and communication than a phalanx. Another example of a formation that required communication and discipline was the testudo, or tortoise formation, used to protect from missiles. The Roman headgear was specifically designed to help facilitate such complex maneuvers on the battlefield. Again, the Roman equipment reflected the Roman tactics. The crest of false hair may actually have been a crest of feathers that could have risen as high as 18 inches above the helmet. It's difficult for historians to say exactly what the crest looked like, as the box or base in which the crest rested and was affixed to the helmet was made of a material like wood, and unlike the metal of the rest of the helmet, these boxes rotted away. We know about them largely from the brackets on helmets designed to attach them. In addition to the intimidation factor of making the soldier appear larger than he was, this ornamentation was used to differentiate between the common soldier and the officer. Some historians believe these crests could have been varied between military groups with varying colors and designs in an effort to create cohesion in a unit. They also believe a legionnaire's crest generally ran front to back, while an officer's crest may have gone from side to side, making him easy to spot on a busy and noisy battlefield. Generals also wore a special cloak to aid communication even further. The colors of this cloak varied and could be anything from purple to white. In addition to the crests on the helmet, some Roman soldiers may have worn animal pelts of their equipment. Pelts of wolves and other animals were used not just for intimidation, but also so that individuals could be easily recognized on the battlefield, performing a function similar to the side-to-side crest of the officers. If a Roman wanted to bring attention to himself, say perhaps to support a political career after his time as a soldier ended, one of the easiest ways to do this was to prove himself brave on the battlefield and earn military honors that could be displayed in their home. An example of this is the corona civica, a simple band of oak leaves that was worn on the head in recognition of a soldier who saved the life of another Roman citizen on the battlefield. But if someone was going to prove themselves brave, they needed witnesses and also to be recognized, and thus we see the necessity of bearing remarkable equipment. Soldiers were probably encouraged to keep their equipment clean. Partially, it was to keep discipline in the ranks, but also the sunlight flashing off of brightly polished swords was part of the psychological warfare of the Roman legions. Sometimes, if the enemy could be thoroughly intimidated by an overwhelming display, they would flee the field before the battle even started, leading to a bloodless victory. One Roman historian wrote, "Soldiers should wave their swords above their heads towards the sun. The polished spearheads, flashing swords, and reflections of the sun from the army sends out a terrible lightning flash of war." Julius Caesar encouraged his troops to incorporate precious metals that had been plundered into their equipment. He believed the addition of these colors could add a decisive edge to his seasoned warriors. Also, in the time before credit cards, adding precious metals to equipment made wealth easier to transport. Need a new horse or a meal? You could just chip the cost off your helmet. In addition, a soldier's wealth was probably safer going into battle on his equipment than being left behind in a camp and treasure for potential looters. Roman equipment can tell you a lot about Romans, but it also tells you a lot about Rome. Many of the armies that they would have been fighting, the soldiers would have been expected to equip themselves, and if they didn't have a lot of money, they might not have much for protection except maybe a shield. They would have been running into disciplined legions where every soldier had a helmet, had chest protection, had greaves. They would have had a large shield called a scudum, one or more javelins called pilum, and a sword called a gladius. And when you look at how all that fits together, you can see how what was really a tiny little state managed to go out and conquer one of the largest empires in history. But perhaps even more importantly, the Roman legions and their equipment represented the whole idea of Rome as a monolithic force. They represented the virtues of citizenship and duty that defined the republic and empire. The Roman legions were made up of more than just Romans. They were an allegory for Rome itself.